Welcome to History 2020. I'm Dr. Sawyer. I will be your professor for today, and hopefully for the rest of the semester. Where's my water? Where's my water? Just a reminder, there's no quiz for the week that this is being recorded, okay? No quiz. We cut it off because of the snow days. So what that means is this lecture, the one before it, will also be covered on the week 5 quiz, and as will the readings. And for those of you guys who maybe skipped a little bit of that last lecture, the readings for this week are on the Philippine-American War. There are different perspectives on them. I really want you guys to be thinking about where these voices fit within this story of the United States abroad. You have readings by Emilio Aguinaldo, who is the leader of the Philippines movement, the rebels there who were trying to maintain independence after Spain leaves and the United States tries to step in or does step in. You have just different perspectives on President McKinley's perspective, and you can see these different sides on it. And that's what we were going to, this week in the discussion session, we were going to go over, or not the discussion session, but the class meeting. We were going to go over these perspectives and kind of how to read them. And we'll do that on Monday. So I've just kind of pushed that stuff forward. So, but keep that in mind, and especially think about how they evoke American history, because it is one of those interesting things, as I talked about in the last lecture, this idea that Aguinaldo and the Philippine independence movement are using the United States' history as a justification for being upset about what's happening. They had expected that because of the U.S. history as a colony that broke away and declared independence, that they would, the U.S. would support Filipino independence. So you can see that all being evoked there. Look at how it's used. I told you history's power. The stories that we tell are powerful. And it is, in this moment, very clear that there's a contradiction between the way the U.S. describes itself and thinks of itself, or people generally do, and the way people abroad are seeing it. And that contrast, that tension that you see being brought up, you see it being brought up by Frederick Douglass in the 19th century. You see it being brought up by the Filipino rebels, Aguinaldo. You're going to see it being brought up by women, right? This is one of the powerful things about the United States, that we do have these things that we care about, that we oftentimes don't live up to it in our past. And one of the things that I will say is powerful about our country, however you feel about things now, one of the things that's powerful is that we're over 200 years into this project, and we haven't abandoned the promises of the founding. People have held onto those, and that's something we share, those promises. It really is a fundamental thing about what it means to be who we are. This Declaration of Independence and this Constitution being two things that bind us all together in our origin story. Evoking those claims, making those promises broader, demanding that they be truly fulfilled. Or as Dr. King said in his I Have a Dream speech, he says, we come here today Dr. King says in his I Have a Dream speech, we have come here today to cash a check. We'll get more into that when we get to the civil rights movement. But the beauty of that line, which I think a lot of people overlook, it's early on, it's one of the first lines there in that speech. We've come here today to cash a check. A promise. What is a check? It's a promise that this money will be here when you get to the bank. He says that because he's not saying we want something extra. We simply want you to fulfill on the promise that was signed, supposed to be delivered. The evocation of that part of our story has been powerful in the past. And again, however you feel about things right now, historically that's been, it's really mattered. So let's get back to the more bombastic side of this story here. Teddy Roosevelt, the man who you saw in the image riding an elephant there. He didn't really do that. It's a political cartoon. That was a thing. Now I guess we do it with videos. But Teddy Roosevelt, out of this war, establishes himself as a national hero. It's a myth, right? When we say a myth, it's this story that has some element to it that's true, but nevertheless is somewhat fabricated. But he comes out a hero. And he himself is an advocate of U.S. expansion abroad. And it's a very interesting thing here, because Teddy Roosevelt at home is very invested and very committed to trying to end the type of corruption that had come to set into the U.S. government in the 19th century. And this is going to make him someone that people really love. But at the same time, he's an ardent advocate of expansion abroad. He has notions of peoples of the world and hierarchies. He's very, very, very invested in a notion of masculinity, which in these types of notions, women have limited roles. But he nevertheless listens to people. Some people. He's complicated. Let's get into it. Now, as he is ascending, these calls for an end to corruption are a part of these movements that are going to come in to shape the country and really begin to change it, to bring about the end of what we call the Gilded Age and bring about what we call the Progressive Era. And this comes, really at the end of the 1890s. Remember I told you the Gilded Age goes to the end of the 1890s. It's not a perfect line, but you see a lot of the forces that were at work beginning to establish themselves and beginning to have a real impact on people's lives. And there's a divergent group of movements that come together to form this progressive era. You have people who have been taking on very different issues. You have folks who are committed to ending poverty in the cities through programs. You have people who are committed to ending child labor. You have folks who want to see the prohibition of alcohol because they believe it's creating this poverty and all this tragedy. You have folks fighting for women's rights. You have the suffragettes beginning to form, and they've been forming they formed a long time ago, but they're beginning to get strength in this era. People taking on the power of big business. I'll add to this, people trying from the South trying to get the word out about what's happening with lynchings. There are a lot of issues that are taking place that Americans have real reason to be upset about. And in this era, people come together in these groups, and you start to see them begin to have a real force in the shape of the country. Now, I don't want to say that sometimes government will give you the old wink and the nod there and tell you, hey, yeah, we're helping you out. But that might have been what was happening at this time, because politicians could feel these waves. And they started passing laws. And this is one of the things you guys should know. I've said it before. It really is important. Any law is only as good as its enforcement. Any law is only as good as its enforcement. So you have federal laws that go on the books in the 1880s and 1890s that are supposed to be aimed at curbing the corruption or the power of business vis-a-vis the average American. They aren't really used, though. A lot of them have to do with the power of these trusts, right? You have the corporation, which I talked about in a previous lecture. Why it's so powerful. And what it can do in terms of mustering, bringing together capital with organization, with technology. But then these corporations get bought up and combined into trust, which is a huge organization in which one or two people can really pull the strings on so many different industries at the same time. Create monopoly conditions. And so there's this Sherman Antitrust Act that's supposed to be available to be used to try to break up monopolies. And instead of it actually being used to break up the business monopolies, it's actually used to try to break down labor is the way it's applied. All these labor unions are creating monopoly on labor. So it ends up not being used for what it had been called for, and used once business realizes that it can be used for their benefit, gets used that way. But people's attitudes start to shift. And we'll talk about kind of what's, some of the reformers that are behind it here in a second. But this attitude, this is the time and place when Teddy Roosevelt ascends to what becomes, I think, in our country, legendary status. He had promised to fight corruption at home. He had done this in the New York police force. Before that, through the federal government. He had worked in a branch of the federal government dedicated to that. He comes back home from the Spanish-American War and immediately wins election. Almost immediately wins election as the governor of the state of New York. This guy is a rising star in the Republican Party. And because of this, in 1900, President William McKinley, who had been elected in 1896, he runs for re-election, but just before the campaign kicks in, his vice president, Gareth Hobart, Garrett Hobart, that's funny. Sorry, it's just me being a nerd. I'm like, Hobart. Anyway, this guy, he dies in office. I wasn't laughing about that. That sounds terrible. You guys were like, Gareth Hobart, the famous vice president, the first vice president from... Yeah, you guys don't know anything about vice presidents. You guys know, like... Look, I didn't even cover this in the class. I didn't cover all the presidents in this era because we're going to pick up here. We've already covered up too much then. But you know, like in 1880, a guy named Garfield was elected. Not the cat. James Garfield is elected. And he's in office a couple months. He's assassinated. And his vice president, Chester Arthur, takes over and serves almost the full term that Garfield had been elected for. Do you know who Arthur's vice president was? Yeah, because he didn't have one. They just didn't have a vice president for like 3.5 years. And everybody was like, it's fine. They didn't even, like, that's how important the role of the vice president is. They just didn't have one. And everybody was like, do we need another one? They were like, yeah, I think so. Like, look, 12th Amendment, you know. So after Hobart dies, McKinley's like, bring this guy Roosevelt on. Because he's well known, he'll hype people up, get them rally, right? The vice president doesn't do a whole lot, but they can make a whole lot of difference in terms of how people feel about your ticket. So in 1900, TR joins that ticket. And in 1900, check this out. They managed to win. Now, the popular vote is fairly close, but look at the electoral vote. Pretty big electoral vote win. But look at the map. Look at the South. Nah, they ain't voting for a Republican. That's the party of Lincoln. So you can see, in that year right there, you're still seeing the South pretty well united in refusing to vote for a Republican. Interesting, huh? Anyway. So they win, and now Teddy Roosevelt is the vice president, which honestly... Roosevelt's, you heard what he did when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the last lecture. So it would be really interesting to know at this point, you're like, what is he going to do if he's the vice president? Because let's face it, like vice president, not that powerful, but still a lot more power. So certainly his time as vice president is going to be eventful, right? Right? Inaugurated in March at this time. And, on September 6th, just a couple months into this, an anarchist named Laws runs up on President McKinley. He was giving a talk in Buffalo, New York. Fires 2 shots, hits him with one. And McKinley, he lives, but he goes to the hospital. Now, here's a headline from San Francisco where they got this news in the next day. I like this one because it's got these pictures of McKinley, man. There's some like nice ones, but like I love old pictures of people like this because you look at McKinley and you're like, is he just a neck? Like, is he a thumb? Look at him. He's got a pop collar. He's just like, there's nothing. Just comes straight up out of his collar there. By the way, he's an older guy. He's going to be the last president who actually fought in the Civil War. So I pointed this out before. That's a shift in leadership that's happening. But look at the bottom here, right? This is stressful. Favorable report on the president's condition. All right, you know what? He got shot, but, fine, right? So Teddy Roosevelt kind of was like, all right, I'm going to go on vacation for a little bit. And guess what? Gets a call. Oh, well, September 14th, like a week later, the president is dead. McKinley dies. So that fascinating period of what would Teddy Roosevelt do as the vice president, we only get a little taste of that. We're talking about, this is 6 months in. And now, TR is the president. You guys notice something? Lots of presidents getting shot back in these days, huh? Lots of presidents getting shot. In fact, there's a pattern that emerges in 1840. And it is that from 1840 on, there's a long run where if you are elected in a year that ends in 0, then you die in office. 1840 is William Henry Harrison. 1860 is President Lincoln. 1880 is Garfield. 1900 is McKinley. 1920 is Warren G. Harding. 1940 is Franklin D. Roosevelt. 1960 is John F. Kennedy. Yeah. 1980 is Ronald Reagan. We'll get to Reagan. I actually just started reading Reaganland, a new book about it. It was actually like 76 to 1980, this era where Reagan emerges. But one of the things about Ronald Reagan was he was married to a woman named Nancy Reagan. Nancy Reagan, she was all like into consulting the stars and everything, like, you know, the astrologer kind of stuff. And she was terrified when Reagan got elected in 1980 because she was like, it's a cursed year. Spoiler alert, a guy does shoot Reagan in 81. But Reagan lives through it. Say what you want about him, he broke the curse. There we go. And then you got George W. Bush, who a guy just throws a shoe at him. You guys ever see that video? Oh, man. You got to be ready. Let me tell you, you got to be ready for something like that. If you're going to throw a shoe at a guy, you got to realize, first of all, that's just not very nice. But second of all, if that dude is pretty agile, you should know about that. Because what? That dude throws a shoe at Bush and he's like, he just moves, right? And the guy's like, well, I got 2 shoes. Boom, he moves 2. All he accomplished was making Bush look awesome. That's all he did. So, like, congratulations, which is why I would like to now recommend, and I know we're getting off topic here, but this is an important thing. In life, you got to be prepared. If that guy had a 3rd shoe, nobody would have expected it. Always bring a 3rd shoe, okay? Because you move once, you move twice, you're like all out of shoes. Watch Bush. He's like, that's when the 3rd one comes, man. All right? Now, don't throw shoes at anybody, especially the president, but anybody in general. But it's just kind of a motto for life. Always bring a 3rd shoe. Anyway, back to Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt does get shot while giving a speech at one point. He did. Just kept on talking. Just bled while he was shot and finished his speech. Again, the legend of Roosevelt. Comes into office, and this guy takes up the reforms like no other. He is going to be active in this. He immediately, like in December, a couple months in, he's like, we're going to curb the trusts. We're going to cut these guys off. A guy named J.P. Morgan, who basically runs the earth at this point, him and a couple of other people. He's a powerful, powerful banker. Roosevelt is going to stand up to him. But he's also going to kind of work with him too. It's a really interesting relationship. Because Roosevelt's the first guy that ever dared to really take on Morgan one-on-one from the government. And in 1902, he breaks up J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities, this huge trust that he had. I mean, we're talking like, this is like walking and getting your first attempt to like play, like your first day in the NBA, and the first thing you do is you try to like dunk on LeBron James. I mean, this guy is like showing up hard. Morgan does not like this. Morgan's not used to it. But he's going to realize that like Roosevelt's somewhat pragmatic with these things. And even though he goes after a bunch of people, initiates 44 lawsuits against major corporations, leads to the breakdown of these, really checks them. He can also see that maybe Roosevelt, and Morgan and these guys can also see that maybe Roosevelt, maybe he's just not after him. In fact, even when you see Roosevelt taking on and supporting labor, you see that he's not totally doing it without a regard for the interests of the businesses to a certain degree. Now, this all goes down in May of 1902. Roosevelt has his first big challenge from labor. Now, you guys may recall this is becoming somewhat of a common thing at this time. right? We had seen there's a huge railroad strike in 1877. What happens? 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes sends out the army to shoot down the workers. And then you saw in the 1890s, there's the Pullman strike. And what happens? President sends out the army to shoot down the workers. And that's what you got to do if the National Guard won't come out and do it for you. The governor called those guys in too. So labor is taking a lot of shots. But they got hard lives. And this is the thing I told you before. Miners, man, miners go into the depths of the earth every day. They're working with explosives. People die down there. You're kind of going to work every day, not sure if you're going to live. So you ain't got nothing, you ain't got nothing to lose. That's a lesson to learn about American society. Don't give people nothing to believe in. These guys go on strike and they shut it down. And they shut down anthracite coal production. And that's what they use at the time to heat houses and heat buildings. Burning that coal. And throughout the summer, the strike goes on. But then you get into the fall. People are looking at the fact that a substantial portion of the homes and buildings in the United States, which were built around this coal, are not going to have heat throughout the winter. Roosevelt had already sent in an investigator to report on it. And he saw that these workers were really being treated poorly. But the owners of the mines refused to budge. Right? They're used to having the government come in on their side. I mean, they're used to having their private guards. I mean, this is a thing. It's like, okay, they're going to go on strike for a while, but then we shoot at them, kill a couple of them, they go back to work. Roosevelt lets it be known that he's not going to do that. Instead of going and saying, all right, we got to get these guys back to work, otherwise people are going to freeze, let's send in the army. He actually goes kind of around. He goes around the tree here. He cuts the other side. He sends one of his guys that he knows, not a government official, but a guy he knows, to go talk to one of J.P. Morgan's people. He says, "Look, nobody's going to win from this. These miners are not actually running. They're probably not on the best side of things." And Roosevelt says, "I'll bet that if old J.P. Morgan would threaten to cut these guys off if they didn't reach a solution. And these guys all know they're powerful, but they ain't J.P. Morgan." So Morgan, kind of informally, sends them the word, you better settle this. And in the end, there's an end to the strike. People don't freeze to death over the winter. And the workers get improved working conditions. Think about this. You're used to the president going, okay, fine, we'll shoot them. And Roosevelt actually comes in and says, hey, I think they got kind of a point here. Let's see what we can do to get this sorted out. And of course, that's the reason all the coal businesses went out of business, right? That's the reason all the coal mines went out of business in 1902, because okay, never mind. They didn't. They kept going. He worked on this. And in fact, he starts to lay out a federal agency that will step in and observe and try to act as an arbiter here, right? Listen to both sides. And this is where you get the Department of Commerce and Labor, which today we have a Department of Labor, which oversees these things, right? Eventually you can bring these to the federal government, intervene to make sure that workers' rights are being upheld. Now we have a lot more rights now than we did back then, but this is a step that a government agency would say we're actually going to listen to both sides, and this makes him popular with labor. He does a lot of things that are groundbreaking, I think. I mean, one of the things he does, and this is fascinating, is that he invites Booker T. Washington to come have dinner with him and his family at the White House. Booker T. Washington is a black man. Incredibly accomplished guy. But to a lot of Americans, he's a black man. That's what they see him as. Doesn't matter what he did. And he invites him not just to the White House, but he invites him to have dinner with him and his family. It doesn't happen again. In fact, you can look at this as a breakthrough moment. You can look at it as a sign of Roosevelt's character. But the dark side of it is that in the South, where lynching had become just a part of the daily routine, keep black folks in their place. When Booker T. Washington went to eat at the White House, and Southerners found out that Roosevelt had him at the same dinner table as Roosevelt's wife and his daughter Alice, white folks in the South decided it was time to make sure that black folks didn't start thinking that they deserved that. And there are calls throughout Southern newspapers for the lynching of hundreds of black people, just to make sure that they know their place. We have some pretty good newspaper database subscriptions at MTSU. We have newspapers.com is free to you guys. You have the New York Times, right? But newspapers.com is a good one because it gets the little newspapers, small town newspapers, right? I mean, you can get, we've always, for a long time, we've had New York Times, right? All that. We actually got Nashville, Tennessean in there, which is one of the big databases. Go to newspapers.com and just search out the dates of this meeting between Roosevelt and Washington, and I think you'll see what you find. Southern newspapers. Now, Roosevelt runs again in 1904, and unless you were wondering how popular he was, wait, no, not unless, that's ridiculous. If you were wondering how popular he was, well, check it out. 1904, he wins over states that they didn't even win in 1900 for the Republicans. This guy is killing it. Except for in the South. Solidly Democratic South. Isn't that fascinating? The South is so solidly Republican now. I mean, the Georgia elections recently, there's now 2 Democratic senators from Georgia, which is mind-blowing. The population, certainly. And, there's a lot of things that play in that, but I think that the population tends to be, by and large, Republican at this point, although it's changing. We'll talk about this change. It's a question a lot of people have. Is how does the South go from being solidly Democratic to solidly Republican? We'll get at it. Some people say, what do they say? They ask the question like, when did it flip? When did it switch? It's a process. It has a lot to do with race. You guys probably wouldn't be surprised about that. In 1904, Roosevelt runs for re-election. Now, keep in mind, he's only run for presidential election one time, and there's no limits anyway. But every other president had limited their time in office to 2 terms. They'd only run for 2, following the precedent of Washington. Roosevelt could not break that pattern. He could have run again in 1908. But in 1904, as a part of his campaign, Roosevelt makes a promise that everyone who knows him is like, what? He promises that he won't seek re-election in 1908 because really he served 8 years anyway. And his family members are like, there is no way he's going to be able to do that. Remember? I told you Alice said that he wanted to be the child at every christening, the bride at every wedding, and the corpse at every funeral. Like this guy, he's got this, it's this dual side to things. On the one hand, people love him. He wants to be loved. He's incredibly popular. He's changing the way the Republican Party works. At the same time, he's gotten to be really full of himself, even more than he was before. I can't believe it. But I guess at that time he believed it. He believed it himself. He's going to do it, but we'll see. He's not going to be happy about it. He continues in these years to push forward with his reforms of government and to put in place government agencies to try to cure the ills. And the people are behind him. It's this thing, man. We go back and forth so hard in American history, We go back and forth so hard between the government can do everything to the government shouldn't do anything. And, that pendulum swings back and forth. You're going from this time where the government has a limited role. It's going to come in the progressive era. You're going to see the people's faith in the government expand. And then the end of World War I, it's going to hit a brick wall, and people are not going to trust the government. It's going to swing hard in the 1920s back to government shouldn't be out here doing things for people. And then the Depression's going to happen. It's going to swing back hard the other direction towards the government should help people. It's going to keep going back and forth even to this modern time. And for a society, the majority of which is inclined to support government intervention, they got their guy with Roosevelt. One of the things he does, guys, and this, it's funny, because you guys don't even probably think about this. I don't think about it enough. I remember taking an institutional economics class where my professor was like, you got to think about how these rules change things. Puts in place the Pure Food and Drug Act. This is the predecessor to the FDA. Now, not to say there aren't reasons to critique these things, and I'm certainly in no way, shape, or form saying that you should reach a conclusion about what to do about it. I will say, though, that the FDA has been pretty instrumental in allowing us to know what's going in our bodies. Do you think that Mountain Dew wants to tell you the name of those chemicals they put in that thing? Have you guys ever looked at the side of some off-brand SpaghettiOs and looked at what's in there? You think they're let's let them know it's got dethylmetrylpropionate in it. No, they don't want to tell you that. They prefer not to. But they have to. They are required to tell you that because it is the law. It's a cost to them. It's even better than that, though, because it's not just what the weird ingredient names are in there and the chemicals. At this time, they're fighting basics. Let me tell you, I'll tell you a little story here. I don't know if you guys have heard this, but a couple of years ago, there was a thing where it was a news story that nobody could quite understand. They were like, the story revolved around a woman who tried to bring across the Canadian border into the United States. She was smuggling in these chocolate eggs called Kinder Surprise. You guys heard of these things? You guys know what a Kinder Surprise is? Now, if you've had one in the United States, you get it, and it's like a plastic toy on one side and chocolate on the other side with a little tip and spin, right? That's not the real Kinder Surprise. A real Kinder Surprise is actually a chocolate egg, and it's awesome. I used to eat them all the time when I lived in Russia, right? It's a chocolate egg. The whole thing, you open it up, it's a chocolate egg, and you break it open. It's got a little thing around. You break open the chocolate egg, and on the inside, there's an awesome toy. The coolest toys that you could possibly, it's in the little yellow plastic thing, right? And it's actually it's probably that big, maybe that big around, something like that. But you take it out, it's got instructions, and all these cool little toys in there. But you can't get them in the United States. They're illegal. And a woman got in trouble for trying to smuggle some into the United States a couple years ago. And people were like, oh my God, this is so dumb. Why can't you have those in the United States? And everyone just assumed the reason that it was illegal to bring those in was because the yellow thing in the middle of it was a choking hazard. They thought it was a choking hazard then. And they were like, and you're right. That thing, if you swallow that thing, you were trying. All right? There's no way you're going to accidentally swallow. A child could not. That thing's more likely to, I don't know, you're more likely to trip over it if it's on the ground if you're a child than you are to swallow. No kid's getting that in there, down their throat at all. And people were like, well, it's stupid federal law. But that's not why it was illegal. It's not a choking hazard thing. Because, that'd be ridiculous. The reason that the Kinder Surprises are illegal in the United States is because under the Pure Food and Drug Act, they put a clause that made it illegal. This is still in the books today. It's illegal to encase a non-food item fully inside of a food item. So because the entire outside of the chocolate egg is chocolate, and on the inside of that chocolate is something that is a toy, it's not legal in the United States. That's a totally different rationale. Now, do you want to know why that's a law? That's a law because prior to these laws that were passed here, prior to the Pure Food and Drug Act, it was a common thing for like meat packing houses to dump things like sawdust into the sausages they sold or other waste products because it helped them get rid of disposal, and they sold the meat by the pound, so it increased the weight of the meat they were selling, and it wouldn't kill you. But was it healthy? And you guys are thinking, well, why don't they just pass a law saying no sawdust in there? You guys don't know how these... I mean, if you'll put sawdust in there, it's not like you're going to be like, oh, well, I guess we got to sell raw meat then. No, they'd be like, well, it didn't say anything about dog bones. I mean, like, you literally... It's to the point where when they pass this law, they go, look, we got to throw a wide net on this one. You cannot encase anything that's not food inside of a food item. And that law's still in the books, and that's the reason you can't get the Kinder Surprise. So, make sense now? Think about the world they're living in here. They have to pass a law to make sure your hot dogs don't have sawdust. Now, to be fair, using hot dogs as an example might be a bad one because food item, maybe not. But I guess it counts. Roosevelt, also an admirer and a lover of the West from that time he went out there and spent. He still goes out west. He helps pass the American Antiquities Act, also known as the National Monuments Act. You're seeing this guy begin to use the federal government to protect national treasures. And the first parks go back from before him. Why does this matter? It matters because these things in Roosevelt's mind belong to all of us. But anybody who's an industrialist would look at these things and say, is there coal in there? Is there gold in there? If so, then I will buy it and I will get it out of there and I will move on. You can't get that stuff back. Nature spent millions of years building this place. You go in there and you rip it apart and you get out the things that are profitable in the minute. The money comes and goes, but the damage stays. Roosevelt knew this. He knew the era he was in. So he decided to pass these laws. And again, it's not like he's taken a lot of power for the executive. Oh my goodness. He has taken a lot of power for the executive. Don't get me wrong here. Starts worrying people. But he's backed by a large contingent of people and movements that I mentioned earlier. When you've got folks known as muckrakers, it's a broad kind of category meant to describe journalists and writers who begin to describe the horrors of life there. You saw the photographs that I used before. Photography becomes powerful. Because as photographic technology improves, people can go in and show other people what life's like in these terrible apartments, in these terrible workplaces. I told you that these employers will shoot their own workers whenever there's a strike. What do you think they'll do to somebody that doesn't even work for them that shows up taking pictures? People are risking themselves to share this. Same time you have journalists. Upton Sinclair, this guy in Chicago, he goes in and he sees what it's like in the meatpacking industry there. It's horrible. I'm actually going to assign you some selections from that for next week. Because it's really, really, really powerful stuff. You have people like Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells she's born into slavery in the 1860s. Family then moves to Memphis. And as she grows up, she's a part of that world where lynching happens. Now keep in mind, she has two things going against her in society at that time. One is that she is black, and two is that she is a woman. But she begins reporting and telling the stories of the lynchings. She saw her friends be lynched. She continues to report. She works for a newspaper in Memphis. And because of her reporting, one of the things that happen is, these white folks will do things to put leverage on black businesses to shut them down if they see as as a threat to their competition, right? Because again, you say, all right, black folks have to eat over there. Then black businesses pop up. Saw this in Wilmington before that riot there. You're going to see it again in Tulsa in 1920. But a lot of times once a prominent black folks, show that they can do these things, they become a competition to the white businesses. Of course they do. And so they'll use violence to shut them down. Use the law to shut them down. Ida B. Wells reports on this. And their newspaper gets shut down. She's run out of Memphis. But she continues to go and report on what's happening to newspapers that will publish her work. All right, here's an example of what I'm talking about. One that might hit close to home. Here, in terms of the business thing. In Nashville, there was a streetcar system. It's the turn of the late 19th, early 20th century. Right? It's a thing that most cities had these, right? Some form of streetcar system, public transportation to get you around the city. And the city passed a law segregating the cars. Make sure black folks couldn't sit on some certain cars, make sure they had to stand up. You guys heard this stuff, right? I mean, this is going to go on. This is going in the 1950s, which Rosa Parks for, right? So, a group of black business people in Nashville, in response to this, were like, no. We're going to build our, if you're going to shut us off and you're going to segregate, we're going to build our own streetcar system. And they built one to compete with the white streetcar system. And they actually install electric streetcars. Now, there was a problem with this because the technology wasn't quite there yet. So they did have issues getting up steep inclines, right? It was the system had problems. So there was that aspect to it. But that was something that we don't know. Could have been worked out. But we don't know because guess what? The city of Nashville saw that happening. And they passed a tax exclusively on electric streetcars. See, the other ones that were being run by the city, they were run off coal. So they go, again, remember, 14th Amendment, equal protection under law. You can't just pass the tax on the black business. So you go, well, just all the electric streetcars here. It jacks the price up on running that streetcar. On top of that, for electricity, they are largely reliant upon the city of Nashville's power plant. So guess what the city does? It oversurges, it sends surges down through these batteries and blows the batteries out on the cars. And the business goes under. That's just a little story from right here, about 3 miles, well, not even 3 miles, right up the street from me is where one of those streetcars ran. It's all around you. And what do you think happens when you invest a lot of money in a technology that might actually be a good idea and it's sabotaged? You fail, you lose your money, and everyone around you who's already inclined to maybe think that black folks aren't as good as white folks go, see, it didn't work anyway. The consequences are profound. On top of all this new information coming out from reporters, you also have a change in the way preachers start preaching. The more notable preachers at the time cease to preach this whole gospel of wealth thing. And you see the voices of those who talk about empathy, talk about Jesus. You guys may notice, there's a whole lot of difference you can get in a sermon if you go Old Testament or New Testament. You get a very different story. The Old Testament's full of a whole lot of you getting what you deserved and a whole lot of violence and wars. And then the New Testament comes around. There's that guy Jesus telling everybody to love each other and look out for everybody. That's a different sermon. But you start seeing that being those teachings, that empathy, the idea that we're all responsible for each other. That becomes more powerful. The voices of the preachers who are preaching that become more prominent. And the labor unions themselves are drawing attention to what's going on. And all this is happening, and it really is, you're starting to see the idea that government can benefit people's lives. But don't forget, we still got TR as president. Everything good he might do here, this isn't the only place he's thinking about. Also thinking about the rest of the world. Roosevelt continues to push for the expansion of the U.S. Navy, continues to see the United States, the Navy's job as securing American markets. He's got this, again, this notion that the United States take on this white man's burden to civilize the rest of the world. And so because of this, you guys might not be surprised to find out that he not so much worried about what the people in the countries want so much as what he knows they need. A couple of big things here. First of all, the Philippines War. This continues under Roosevelt. Millions of Filipinos are going to die from the starvation. Not just the fighting, but the starvation that comes along with trying to cut off guerrilla warfare, disease. And also, he keeps it going in Central America. You guys may recall the Caribbean is a place where recently we just annexed Puerto Rico, not Cuba though. We didn't annex them. We just told them they had to ask us if they did anything, but they were independent. But they couldn't do anything without asking us. But they had their independence. But they had to ask us before they did anything. But they were independent, so they didn't have to ask anybody except for us. So we had that gone with the Platt Amendment. Puerto Rico became ours. But then, remember earlier in the semester when I told you that if you wanted to go from New York to San Francisco by boat, you had to go through Nicaragua and get off that boat? There had been talk about building a canal for a long time. And the canal rights to build in Nicaragua were worked out by the Germans and the French, and the United States was like, nah, so we put a kibosh to that. I think a kibosh, is that the right word? I don't know. We stopped it, used our influence to stop it there. And we decided that we were going to build a canal somewhere else. We were going to build a canal through, that's right, Colombia. We were going to build a canal through Colombia. We sent our guys down there to negotiate a deal to get the rights to this area in northern Colombia, kind of just an isthmus connecting it up there into Costa Rica, that area, part of the world. And Colombia agreed to it at first, right? Their diplomats agreed to it. But then the government of Colombia was like, no, why would we give? I mean, it's not a good deal for us. We don't want to do that. It's a lot of foreign influence we're going to give away if we just turn that over to the Americans because they want to control it, because they're going to build it. So no, we're good. So Roosevelt, he decides that the Colombians really can't manage this themselves, right? They're going to need us to teach them. So here is Teddy Roosevelt's plan for building the Panama Canal. Step 1, you got to build Panama, because Panama is not a country. So what you do is you send in the Marines, you invade that portion of Colombia, you force Colombian troops out of there, you then find a guy there who's like, yeah, we're Panama. You get that guy into power. You help that part of Colombia declare independence, and you've built Panama, and you guys are not going to believe this. After that, government took over in Panama, after that part of Panama declared independence. I mean, what luck. The guy who ends up becoming the leader of that country is cool with us building a canal there. How awesome is that? What a surprise. And so, that good fortune behind us, we began building really one of the great marvels in the world, the Panama Canal, which for the first time when it opens in 1914, allows you to ship goods, put it on a boat in New York, take it all the way across to San Francisco. Revolutionizes transportation. He also begins to assert in this Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, he begins to assert the power of the United States to influence anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And one last thing he does, and this is interesting. We'll end on this. In 1905, there's a war waging between Russia and Japan. You guys don't think about this a lot, but if you look at a map of the world, you think about Russia as being on the European side, but actually Russia goes all the way across the Pacific. It borders China and North Korea over there. Today, it's roughly the same, kind of the same borders, right? I mean, there's still Manchuria. Don't worry about it. But right across from that border, from the Pacific coast of Russia, is Japan. Now, Japan, you may know, is the country that was pretty upset about us taking the Philippines because it was pretty clear that we were fighting them for possession of the islands in the Pacific because Japan was industrializing too. They wanted the resources. I know you guys are going to be blown away when you find out that it wasn't just like out of nowhere that we and Japan were rivals in World War II. We had been staking claims to islands and land all over Asia and kind of angling at each other for decades. But at this point, Japan's mad at the Russians because the Russians are encroaching on them. So the two of those countries go to war. It's called the Russo-Japanese War. Little tiny island of Japan versus 1/6 of the world's landmass, the Russian Empire. And the Russians get their asses kicked. I mean, it's not even close. The Russians have like a wooden fleet, and Japan industrialized, like baller industrialized. I don't know if that's the thing I can say in a lecture. I don't know how to describe it better than that. I mean, Japan was on fire with their industrialization, and they built these awesome steel ships. And so when the Russians sailed their fleet around the world to go fight the Japanese just blew up everything. And now the Japanese were like, well, we're routing these guys. Well, we can take more land from them. We can take over their influence in China. We can take their land. And Teddy Roosevelt looks at it and goes, I think I should step in there and try to negotiate an end to this war. And he does. The Treaty of Portsmouth ends that war, ends the conflicts there, and Teddy Roosevelt wins a Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, this is, again, another thing this guy did, won the Nobel Peace Prize for ending a war between Russia and Japan. How nice of him. Nice. Should always ask in any situation what was in it for them. And for Teddy Roosevelt, in the United States, we were very interested in taking a lot of the land that Japan was taking. We saw ourselves in a direct competition with them for the Pacific, and the prospect that the war would go on and Japan would gain total dominance of that area after crushing completely the Russian Empire. That's kind of a problem for the United States, because then they wouldn't be checked by the Russians, which would mean that they'd be more free to compete with us. It's a big part of it. Roosevelt did not want the Japanese to have that power. So, guys, remember, believe in yourselves. Sometimes, if you want to build something and someone won't let you, you've got to take the land from them and proclaim it an independent republic. So, therefore, you can get what you want. But don't do that. Also, remember, always bring a third shoe. I'm Dr. Sawyer. Have a great day.